Some packages aren't meant to be opened. Brenda Philips learned this the hard way when a delivery with no return address appeared at her door, and opening it set off a chain of events that would trap her in a nightmare she couldn't escape. What started as curiosity became a descent into pure terror, as each new package pulled her deeper into a contract signed in blood 66 years ago. This is the story of how an ordinary woman became the target of something that doesn't just want to scare you, it wants to own you. And by the time Brenda understood what was happening, it was already too late. Brenda Philips had always loved the sound of rain against her apartment windows. It made her feel safe, cocooned in her third-floor studio, while the world outside dissolved into gray sheets of water. But on that particular Thursday evening in October, as she sat curled on her couch with a mug of chamomile tea, the rain felt different, heavier, more insistent, like it was trying to tell her something. She was scrolling through her phone, half watching a true crime documentary she'd seen twice before, when the knock came. 3 sharp raps that cut through the white noise of the storm. Brenda glanced at the clock on her microwave. 8:47. Too late for neighbors, too early for emergencies. The knock came again, same rhythm, same intensity. Brenda set down her mug and padded to the door in her wool socks, her heart doing that stupid flutter it always did when unexpected things happened after dark. She was 28 years old and lived alone in a city where everyone was a stranger. Caution had become her default setting. Through the peephole, she saw nothing but the dim hallway, its fluorescent light flickering like it had been threatening to die for months. No person, no shadow, nothing. She was about to turn away when she looked down and saw it. A package sat directly in front of her door, medium-sized, wrapped in brown paper that looked oddly dry despite the storm. No shipping label, no return address, just her name written across the top in elegant, old-fashioned script, Brenda Philips. Her first thought was that one of her neighbors had left it, maybe Mrs. Kowalski from 3B, who sometimes accepted deliveries when Brenda was at work. But Mrs. Kowalski always knocked more gently, always called out in her thick Polish accent to let Brenda know it was her. Brenda opened the door and immediately felt the temperature drop. The hallway was always cold, the building's heating system was a joke, but this was different. This was the kind of cold that came from inside, that settled into your bones before you even realized you were shivering. She bent down and picked up the package. It was heavier than it looked, and the paper felt strange under her fingers. Not quite cardboard, not quite wood, something in between, something that seemed to pulse with a warmth that contradicted the cold air around it. Back inside her apartment, Brenda locked the door and set the package on her Kit Phillips counter. She stared at it for a long moment, her rational mind trying to supply explanations. A gift from her mother, maybe, though her mother lived in California and always used Amazon. A mistake from a delivery service that forgot to scan the label. A prank from her coworker Danny, who thought he was funnier than he actually was. But none of those explanations felt right. Brenda grabbed a pair of scissors from her junk drawer and cut through the twine that held the paper together. The wrapping fell away easily, almost eagerly, revealing a wooden box underneath. The wood was dark, almost black, with intricate carvings etched into every surface. Symbols she didn't recognize, patterns that seemed to shift when she wasn't looking directly at them. There was no lock, just a simple brass clasp. Brenda's hand hovered over it. Some deep, primal part of her brain was screaming at her to stop, to throw the box away, to pretend she'd never seen it. But curiosity was a powerful thing. Curiosity was what made her open spam emails and click on links she knew she shouldn't. Curiosity was what made her human. She flipped the clasp. The lid opened with a soft creak, and Brenda found herself staring at a single object nestled in black velvet. A key, old and ornate, made of tarnished silver with a bow shaped like a crescent moon. It was beautiful in the way antique things are beautiful, full of history and weight, and the fingerprints of people long dead. Beneath the key was a card, cream-colored and thick. Brenda lifted the key carefully and picked up the card. The same elegant handwriting from the package adorned its surface, but this time the message was longer. Every door has a lock. Every lock has a key. Some doors should never be opened, but once you hold the key, you'll find yourself looking for the door. You have 7 days to decide. The choice is yours, but the consequences are eternal. Brenda read the message 3 times, her confusion deepening with each pass. 7 days to decide what? What door? What consequences? She turned the card over, hoping for more information, but the back was blank. She examined the key again, holding it up to the light. It looked old, genuinely old, not artificially aged like the vintage jewelry sold at hipster markets. The silver had a patina that came from decades, maybe centuries, of existence. Brenda set both items back in the box and closed the lid. Her tea had gone cold. The documentary had ended, replaced by autoplay recommendations she wasn't watching. Outside, the rain had intensified, drumming against the windows with a fury that matched the sudden unease spreading through her chest. She told herself it was just a weird prank. Someone with too much time and a twisted sense of humor. She'd throw it away in the morning and forget about it. But even as she thought this, Brenda knew she wouldn't. The key was already calling to her, whispering promises of mysteries solved and secrets revealed. She could feel it from across the room, a magnetic pull that made her fingers itch to hold it again. That night, Brenda dreamed of doors, hundreds of them, stretching down an endless hallway that smelled of dust and decay. Each door was different, some wooden, some metal, some that seemed to be made of shadow itself. And she was walking down that hallway with the key clutched in her hand, trying every lock, desperate to find the one that fit. When she finally found it, a red door at the very end of the hall, its paint peeling like dead skin, she inserted the key with trembling hands. The lock turned with a click that echoed like thunder. The door swung open, and Brenda woke up screaming. The next morning, Brenda called in sick to work. She told her boss she had a migraine, which wasn't entirely a lie. Her head was pounding, and she'd barely slept after the nightmare. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw that red door, felt the weight of the key in her palm, heard the echo of that terrible click. She made coffee and tried to convince herself she was being ridiculous. It was just a dream, just a weird package, nothing to lose sleep over. But when she walked into her Kit Phillips and saw the box still sitting on her counter, exactly where she'd left it, the unease came flooding back. Brenda opened the box again, half expecting, half hoping that it would be empty, that the key and the card would have vanished like they'd never existed. But they were still there, looking exactly the same. The key gleamed in the morning light streaming through her windows, and the card's message seemed darker somehow, more ominous in the harsh light of day. She decided to do what any reasonable person would do in the age of information. She Googled it. Brenda spent the next 2 hours searching for anything related to mysterious packages, antique keys, cryptic messages, and 7-day countdowns. She found conspiracy theories, urban legends, and a disturbing number of creepypasta stories, but nothing that matched her exact situation, nothing that felt real. She was about to give up when she stumbled across a forum post from 3 years ago. A user named NightOwl87 had described receiving a similar package, brown paper, no return address, a wooden box with an antique object inside. In their case, it had been a pocket watch. The message had been different but equally cryptic, something about time running out and choices that couldn't be unmade. Brenda's pulse quickened as she scrolled through the responses. Most people had dismissed it as creative writing, a setup for some alternate reality game. But one response, from a user named Margaret K., had caught her attention. If you receive the package, you need to understand something. This isn't a game. This isn't a prank. You've been chosen, and there's a reason for it. The 7 days aren't a countdown to something happening, they're a countdown to when you have to make your choice. Whatever you do, don't ignore it. Ignoring it makes it worse. The post had been made 3 years ago. Brenda clicked on Margaret K's profile, but it had been deleted. No other posts. No trace of who they were or what had happened to them. She tried to find NightOwl87's profile next, but that too had been deleted. Brenda sat back in her chair, her coffee forgotten and cold. The rational part of her brain was still insisting this was all elaborate nonsense, maybe even a viral marketing campaign for some horror movie or video game. But the irrational part, the part that had woken up screaming, the part that could still feel the key's weight in her hand, knew better. Something was happening, something real. The second package arrived that afternoon. Brenda had been trying to distract herself with mindless television when she heard it, a soft thud against her door, like someone had set something down very carefully. No knock this time, no warning. She approached the door, slowly, her heart hammering in her chest. Through the peephole, she saw another package, identical to the first. Same brown paper, same dry appearance despite the rain that was still falling outside, same elegant handwriting spelling out her name. Brenda's hand shook as she opened the door and grabbed the package. The hallway was empty again, but this time she noticed something she'd missed before. Wet footprints leading away from her door. Not shoe prints, these were bare feet, small and delicate, leaving puddles of water that seemed too dark to be rain. She slammed the door and locked it, her breath coming in short gasps. The package felt heavier than the first one, and colder, like it had been stored in a freezer. Inside, Brenda found another wooden box, this one slightly larger. The carvings were different but equally intricate, forming patterns that hurt to look at too long. She opened it with shaking hands. This time, there were 2 items. A small mirror with a silver frame, its glass so dark it barely reflected anything, and another card. The message read, "Day 2. Have you started looking for the door yet? You will. They always do. The mirror shows what's coming. Look closely, Brenda. Look at what you're becoming." Brenda dropped the card like it had burned her. Her name. They'd used her name this time, not just written it on the package, but embedded it in the message itself. This wasn't random. This wasn't a prank. Someone knew who she was. Someone was watching. She picked up the mirror with trembling fingers and looked into its dark surface. At first, she saw nothing but shadows. Then, slowly, an image began to form. It was her face, but wrong. Her eyes were hollow, her skin pale and stretched too tight over her bones. Her mouth was open in a silent scream, and behind her, barely visible in the darkness, was a figure, tall and thin, with impossibly long fingers reaching toward her shoulders. Brenda threw the mirror across the room. It hit the wall, but didn't break, just clattered to the floor and lay there, face down, like it was waiting. She grabbed her phone and called the police. The officer who answered listened patiently as Brenda explained about the packages, the messages, the feeling of being watched. When she finished, there was a long pause before he spoke. He told her that without any direct threats or evidence of stalking, there wasn't much they could do. He suggested she file a report if she wanted, maybe install a security camera, and definitely not open any more packages if they arrived. His tone was kind but dismissive. Brenda could hear it in his voice. He thought she was overreacting, maybe even making it up for attention. She thanked him and hung up, feeling more alone than ever. That night, Brenda didn't sleep at all. She sat on her couch with all the lights on, staring at the 2 boxes on her Kit Phillips counter and the mirror lying face down on her floor. The key from the first box was in her pocket. She'd put it there without thinking, and now she couldn't bring herself to take it out. Outside, the rain continued to fall, and somewhere in the building, she could hear footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming closer. By day 3, Brenda had stopped pretending she could ignore what was happening. The packages weren't going to stop. The messages weren't going to explain themselves. And whatever was behind this, whoever was behind this, knew exactly where she lived and exactly how to get to her. She'd spent the previous night researching obsessively, falling down rabbit holes of occult forums and paranormal investigation sites. Most of it was garbage, the digital equivalent of people shouting into the void. But occasionally, she'd find something that made her blood run cold. Stories of people who'd received mysterious objects, warnings about contracts made in darkness, references to something called the delivery, a phenomenon that supposedly dated back centuries, where cursed items were sent to the descendants of people who'd made deals with forces that shouldn't be named. The word that kept appearing was inheritor, as if these packages weren't random at all, but targeted, as if the recipients had inherited something they never asked for. Brenda had called her mother that morning, trying to keep her voice steady as she asked casual questions about their family history. Her mother, surprised but pleased by the sudden interest, had talked for nearly an hour about Brenda's grandparents, her great-grandparents, the Phillips family line that stretched back to a small village in rural China. Nothing unusual, nothing dark, just ordinary people living ordinary lives. But when Brenda asked about her father's side, her father, who'd died when she was 6, who she barely remembered, her mother had gone quiet. She'd said that Brenda's paternal grandfather had been a difficult man, secretive and superstitious, who died under circumstances the family didn't like to discuss. Then she'd changed the subject, asking Brenda if she was feeling all right, if something was wrong. Brenda had lied and said everything was fine. Now, sitting in her apartment as afternoon light filtered through the windows, Brenda stared at the 3 objects laid out on her coffee table: the key, the mirror, and a notebook she'd started keeping to document everything. She'd written down every detail she could remember, every strange occurrence, every word from the cards. Looking at it all together, she could see a pattern forming, a progression. The key represented choice. The mirror represented consequence. What would the 3rd package bring? She didn't have to wait long to find out. At exactly 3:30 in the afternoon, Brenda heard it again, that soft thud against her door. She'd been expecting it, dreading it, and yet when it came, her whole body went rigid with fear. This time, She looked through the peephole before opening the door. The hallway was empty, but the package was there, larger than the previous two. And this time, there was something else. A wet trail leading from the package to the stairwell, as if something had dragged itself through water to make the delivery. Brenda opened the door quickly, grabbed the package, and slammed the door shut in one fluid motion. Her hands left damp prints on the brown paper. The package was soaking wet, water dripping onto her floor in steady drops that sounded too loud in the silence of her apartment. She carried it to her bathtub, not wanting to ruin her floors any more than necessary, and unwrapped it there. The paper came away in soggy pieces, revealing a wooden box that looked waterlogged and ancient, as if it had been pulled from the bottom of a lake. Inside was a photograph. Brenda's breath caught in her throat as she lifted it from the box. It was old, black and white, the edges yellowed with age. It showed a man standing in front of a house she didn't recognize. He was wearing clothes from another era, the 1952, maybe, or early 60s. His face was stern, unsmiling, and there was something about his eyes that made Brenda's skin crawl. They were dark and intense, staring directly at the camera with an expression that was almost challenging. But it was the house behind him that made Brenda's blood run cold, because even though she'd never seen it before, she recognized it, not from memory, but from her dream. It was the house at the end of that endless hallway, the one with the red door. She turned the photograph over with shaking hands. Written on the back in faded ink was a name, Philips Way, 1959. Her grandfather, her father's father, the difficult, secretive man her mother hadn't wanted to talk about. Beneath the photograph in the box was another card, this one water-stained and barely legible. Day 3. The door is real, Brenda. It's been waiting for 66 years. Your grandfather found it, opened it, and made a deal he couldn't keep. Now the debt passes to you. 4 more days to find it. 4 more days to decide if you'll honor what he promised, or if you'll suffer what he escaped. Brenda's hands were shaking so badly she almost dropped the card. 66 years. Her grandfather had died 66 years ago, when her father was just a child. The family had never talked about how he died, just that it had been sudden and tragic. She pulled out her phone and called her mother again, but this time she didn't bother with pleasantries or casual questions. She asked directly about Philips Way, about how he died, about what he'd been involved in before his death. Her mother's voice had turned cold, defensive. She told Brenda that some things were better left buried, that dredging up the past wouldn't change anything. But when Brenda pressed, when she said she needed to know, her mother finally relented. Philips Way had been found dead in his study, she said, surrounded by books and papers covered in symbols no one could read. The official cause of death was a heart attack, but there had been rumors, whispers that he'd been involved in dark practices, that he'd been trying to contact something that shouldn't be contacted. The family had burned everything in that study, had tried to erase every trace of whatever he'd been doing. Brenda asked about the house in the photograph, but her mother said she didn't know anything about it. Philips Way had owned several properties, and after his death, they'd all been sold quickly. The family had wanted nothing to do with his legacy. When Brenda hung up, she felt like she was drowning. The pieces were coming together, forming a picture she didn't want to see. Her grandfather had made some kind of deal, had opened some kind of door, and now, 66 years later, whatever he'd promised was coming to collect. From her, she looked at the photograph again, studying her grandfather's face, trying to see some resemblance to herself. She had his eyes, she realized. The same dark, intense eyes that stared out from the photograph with that challenging expression. What had he done? What had he promised? And why did she have to pay for it? Brenda spent the rest of day 3 and all of day 4 trying to find the house from the photograph. She used reverse image search, posted in local history groups, even visited the public library to look through old property records. Nothing. It was as if the house had never existed, or had been deliberately erased from every record. But on day 5, the house found her. Brenda had gone to work that morning, desperate for some semblance of normalcy. She'd told herself that sitting in her apartment, obsessing over the packages, was only making things worse. She needed to be around people, needed to pretend that her life wasn't falling apart. It had almost worked. For a few hours, surrounded by the familiar chaos of her office, Brenda had managed to push the fear to the back of her mind. Her coworker, Danny, had made his usual terrible jokes. Her boss had complained about the same things he always complained about. Everything was normal. Then, during her lunch break, Brenda had received an email. The sender was listed as The Keeper, and the subject line was simply, Day 5. Brenda's hands had frozen over her keyboard. She'd stared at the email for a long moment before finally clicking it open. There was no message, just an attachment, a PDF file labeled The Door, PDF. Brenda downloaded it with trembling fingers and opened it on her phone. It was a map, hand-drawn, detailed, showing streets and landmarks she recognized from her city, and at the center, marked with a red X, was an address. Beneath the map was a single line of text. The door is waiting. You have 2 days left. Come alone. Brenda had left work immediately, ignoring her boss's protests, ignoring Danny's concerned questions. She'd gotten in her car and driven to the address, her heart pounding so hard she thought she might pass out. The house was in an old part of the city she rarely visited, tucked away on a street that seemed to exist in permanent shadow. It was exactly as it appeared in the photograph, same structure, same proportions, same unsettling presence. But it was also different, older, more decrepit. The paint was peeling, the windows were boarded up, and the yard was overgrown with weeds that looked more like grasping fingers than plants. And there, barely visible beneath decades of grime and neglect, was the red door. Brenda had sat in her car for nearly an hour, staring at the house, trying to work up the courage to approach it. The street was empty, no other cars, no pedestrians. It felt like she'd driven into a pocket of reality that existed outside normal space and time. Finally, as the sun began to set, Brenda had gotten out of her car. She'd walked up the cracked pathway to the front door, each step feeling like she was wading through water. The key in her pocket had grown warm, almost hot, as if it knew it was close to its purpose. Brenda had stood in front of the red door, her hand hovering over the peeling paint. She could hear something on the other side, not quite voices, not quite music, something in between, something that made her teeth ache and her vision blur. She'd pulled out the key, held it up to the lock. It fit perfectly, sliding in like it had been made for this door and this door alone. But Brenda hadn't turned it, not yet, because turning it would mean accepting that all of this was real, that her grandfather had done something terrible, that she was somehow responsible for fixing it. Instead, she'd pulled the key out and run back to her car, her breath coming in panicked gasps. She'd driven home too fast, nearly running 2 red lights, and locked herself in her apartment. That night, the 5th package had arrived. Brenda had heard the thud and had almost ignored it, almost decided that she was done playing this game, done being manipulated by forces she didn't understand. But curiosity, that same terrible curiosity that had made her open the first package, had won out. This box was the smallest yet, barely larger than a jewelry box. Inside was a single item, a contract. It was written on parchment that felt like skin, in ink that looked disturbingly like blood. The language was old, formal, full of legal terminology that Brenda had to read 3 times to understand. But the basic meaning was clear. Phillips Way had made a deal in 1959. In exchange for wealth, success, and protection for his family, he had promised to deliver his firstborn grandson to the Keeper on the 66th anniversary of the contract. The contract specified that the delivery would be made willingly, that the grandson would open the door and step through of his own accord. But Phillips Way's firstborn grandson, Brenda's father, had died young, before the debt could be collected. The contract had specific provisions for this scenario. The debt would pass to the next generation, to the firstborn grandchild, to Brenda. She had 2 days left. 2 days to decide whether to honor a contract she'd never agreed to, made by a man she'd never known, for reasons she couldn't understand. Or 2 days to find a way out. The card that came with the contract was longer than the others. Day 5, Brenda. You've seen the door. You've held the key. You understand now what your grandfather did, what he promised, what he failed to deliver. The choice is yours, but understand this. Debts unpaid don't disappear. They grow, they fester, they consume. If you don't open that door and step through, the Keeper will come for you anyway, but it won't be quick. It won't be clean. It will take everything, your sanity, your soul, everyone you've ever loved. The door is mercy. The door is the easy way. You have 48 hours to decide. Choose wisely. Brenda had read the message until the words blurred together, until she'd memorized every curve of every letter. Then she'd done something she hadn't done since she was a child. She'd prayed. She didn't know who she was praying to, or if anyone was listening, but she prayed anyway, begging for guidance, for strength, for some kind of sign that would tell her what to do. The only answer was the sound of rain starting again outside her window, and the feeling of the key burning in her pocket like a brand. Day 6 arrived with a gray dawn that felt more like an ending than a beginning. Brenda hadn't slept. She'd spent the entire night sitting at her Kit Phillips table. The contract spread out before her, reading and rereading its archaic terms until her eyes burned and her head throbbed with exhaustion. But somewhere around 4 in the morning, between her 10th and 11th reading, something had shifted inside her. The fear that had been paralyzing her for days began to transform into something else. Anger, determination, a stubborn refusal to accept that her life could be dictated by a deal made before she was born. She wasn't going to run, she wasn't going to hide, and she certainly wasn't going to walk through that red door without understanding exactly what she was walking into. If her grandfather had found a way to make this deal, then there had to be a way to break it. Brenda made coffee as the sun rose, strong and black, and began to plan. She pulled out her laptop and started searching with a new purpose, no longer looking for explanations but for solutions. She searched for information about breaking supernatural contracts, about escaping debts to entities that existed outside normal reality, about people who'd faced similar situations and survived. Most of what she found was useless fantasy fiction masquerading as fact, role-playing game rules, new age nonsense about crystals and positive energy. But buried deep in an obscure forum dedicated to occult history, she found a thread that made her pause. A user named Solomon Gray had posted about something called the Keepers game, a phenomenon that supposedly dated back centuries. According to the post, the Keeper was an entity that made deals with desperate people, offering them everything they wanted in exchange for future payment. The payment was always the same: a life, a soul, a willing sacrifice delivered through a door that existed between worlds. But the post also mentioned something else: a loophole. The contract required that the debt be paid willingly, which meant that if the person could prove they'd been coerced, manipulated, or deceived, the contract could be voided. The challenge was finding evidence of the deception and presenting it to the Keeper before the deadline expired. Brenda's hands trembled as she typed a response to the 3-year-old post, asking for more information, begging for help. She didn't expect an answer. The user's profile showed they hadn't been active in years, but she had to try. To her shock, a response came within minutes. Solomon Gray wrote that he'd been waiting for her message, that he'd known someone would eventually come looking for answers about Phillips Way's contract. He explained that he was a researcher who specialized in documenting cases of supernatural debt, and that he'd been tracking the Keeper's activities for over a decade. Phillips Way's case had been one of the most interesting he'd encountered because Phillips Way had almost found the loophole, had almost escaped the contract, but had died before he could complete the process. The user asked if Brenda could meet him that morning. He had documents that might help her, information that couldn't be shared digitally. He gave her an address, a coffee shop in the same neighborhood as the house with the red door. Brenda stared at the message, her instincts screaming that this was a trap. Meeting a stranger from the internet who claimed to know about her family's dark history was exactly the kind of thing that got people killed in horror movies. But what choice did she have? She had less than 48 hours, and this was the first real lead she'd found. She wrote back agreeing to meet him at 10 o'clock, then spent the next 3 hours preparing. She sent emails to 3 different friends with all the information she had: copies of the photographs, transcriptions of the cards, screenshots of her conversation with Solomon Gray. She told them that if they didn't hear from her by noon, they should go to the police. She knew it probably wouldn't help, but it made her feel slightly less like she was walking blindly into danger. At 9:30, Brenda grabbed her keys and headed out. She'd put the silver key from the first package in her pocket, along with the photograph of her grandfather, the mirror, and the contract she left in her apartment, hidden in a drawer. If this was a trap, if something happened to her, at least there would be evidence left behind. The coffee shop was small and nearly empty when Brenda arrived. She ordered a latte she had no intention of drinking and sat at a corner table where she could watch the door. At exactly 10 o'clock, a man walked in. He was older than she'd expected, probably in his 60s, with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses that gave him a professorial air. He wore a tweed jacket despite the mild weather, and carried a worn leather messenger bag that looked like it had seen decades of use. His eyes scanned the coffee shop until they landed on Brenda, and he smiled a gentle, sad smile that somehow made her feel both comforted and deeply uneasy. He approached her table and asked if she was Brenda Philips. When she nodded, he introduced himself as Solomon Gray, though he said that wasn't his real name. Real names had power, he explained, especially in situations like this. It was better to keep some things hidden. He sat down across from her and pulled a thick folder from his messenger bag. Inside were documents, photographs, and handwritten notes that looked like they'd been compiled over years. He spread them across the table, and Brenda found herself staring at her family's history laid out in meticulous detail. Solomon explained that he'd been researching the keeper since his own sister had received a package 20 years ago. She'd refused to believe it was real, had thrown away the objects and ignored the messages. On the 7th day, she'd vanished. No body was ever found, no trace of what had happened to her, just an empty apartment and the lingering smell of something burning. Since then, Solomon had dedicated his life to understanding the keeper, to finding patterns and loopholes, to helping others who found themselves trapped in impossible contracts. He documented dozens of cases, and while he hadn't been able to save everyone, he'd helped some people escape. He told Brenda that her grandfather had been brilliant but arrogant. Philips Way had sought out. The keeper, deliberately, had wanted the power and wealth that came with making a deal. But he'd also believed he was clever enough to find a way out of paying the debt. He'd spent years researching, had filled journals with notes about contract law and supernatural loopholes, and had eventually discovered the same information Solomon had found. The contract could be voided if deception could be proven. Philips Way had been gathering evidence when he died. Solomon had copies of some of his journals, had been trying to piece together what Philips Way had discovered. The problem was that Philips Way had been paranoid, had written in codes and symbols that were difficult to decipher. But there was one thing that came through clearly. Philips Way believed the keeper had lied about something fundamental in the original contract, something that, if exposed, would invalidate the entire agreement. Brenda leaned forward, her heart racing. She asked what the lie was, what her grandfather had discovered. Solomon shook his head slowly. He said he didn't know. Philips Way had died before he could document it clearly. But he believed the answer was in the house, behind the red door, not through the door that was the trap, the point of no return, but somewhere in the house itself. Philips Way had hidden something there, some piece of evidence that would prove the keeper's deception. Brenda felt hope and despair warring in her chest. She had to go back to that house, had to search it, but she only had until tomorrow. And if she was wrong, if there was nothing there, she'd have wasted her last day chasing a ghost. Solomon reached across the table and placed his hand over hers. He told her that she was braver than his sister had been, braver than most people who found themselves in this situation. He said that if anyone could find what Philips Way had hidden, it was her. She had his blood, his intelligence, his stubborn refusal to accept defeat. He gave her one more thing before they parted, a small leather pouch filled with salt. He explained that salt was a traditional ward against supernatural entities, that it might not stop the keeper, but it could slow it down, create barriers that would buy her time. He told her to line the doorways and windows of the house with it before she started searching, to create a protected space where she could work. Brenda took the pouch and thanked him, her voice thick with emotion. Solomon stood to leave, but paused and looked back at her. He said that whatever she decided, whether she found the evidence or not, whether she walked through that door or ran as far as she could, she should know that none of this was her fault. She didn't deserve this burden. The universe was sometimes cruel and arbitrary, and the only thing anyone could do was fight back as hard as they could. Then he was gone, disappearing into the gray morning like he'd never been there at all. Brenda returned to the house with the red door at noon, armed with Solomon's salt and a determination that felt fragile but real. The street was just as empty as it had been the day before, just as shadowed and wrong. But this time, Brenda didn't hesitate. She walked straight up the pathway, past the grasping weeds and cracked concrete, and stood before the door. She pulled out the silver key and inserted it into the lock, but didn't turn it. Instead, she tried the doorknob. To her surprise, it turned easily. The door swung open with a groan that sounded almost like a sigh of relief, as if the house had been waiting for her to finally enter. The interior was dark and smelled of mold and decay. Brenda pulled out her phone and turned on its flashlight, sweeping the beam across what had once been a living room. Furniture sat covered in dusty sheets, and the walls were lined with empty bookshelves. Everything looked abandoned, forgotten, left to rot. But there was something else too, a feeling, a presence. The house wasn't empty. Something was here, watching, waiting. Brenda pulled out the pouch of salt and began lining the doorway, creating a barrier between herself and whatever might try to follow her in. She did the same with the windows she could reach, moving methodically through the first floor. The salt left white lines in the dust, stark and bright in the gloom. When she finished, she began to search. She started with the obvious places: drawers, closets, behind furniture. She found nothing but debris and evidence of time's passage. Old newspapers from the 1950s, broken dishes, a child's toy that might have belonged to her father. She moved to the second floor, her footsteps creaking on stairs that felt dangerously unstable. More empty rooms, more dust, more nothing. Brenda was beginning to despair when she found the study. It was at the end of the hallway, behind a door that had been sealed with boards that looked newer than the rest of the house. Someone had tried to keep this room closed, had wanted to make sure no one could enter. Brenda pulled at the boards until they came loose, her hands getting splinters, and her arms aching with effort. The door behind the boards was locked, but not with the normal lock. It had a symbol carved into it, the same symbol she'd seen on the wooden boxes from the packages. Brenda pulled out the silver key and tried it. The lock clicked open. Inside, the study was exactly as Solomon had described from Phillips Way's death. Books lined every wall, their spines cracked and faded. Papers covered the desk, filled with symbols and notes in Chinese and English. And in the center of the room, drawn on the floor in what looked like chalk or paint, was a circle filled with more symbols. Brenda approached the desk carefully, her light sweeping across the papers. Most of them were incomprehensible, filled with diagrams and equations that looked more like madness than research. But then she found it, a journal, leather-bound and thick, with her grandfather's name embossed on the cover. She opened it with trembling hands and began to read. The journal documented everything: Phillips Way's initial contact with the keeper, the negotiation of terms, the signing of the contract, and then, years later, his growing suspicion that something was wrong. Phillips Way had discovered that the keeper had lied about the fundamental nature of the deal. The contract stated that in exchange for wealth and protection, Phillips Way would deliver his firstborn grandson, but the keeper had never specified what would happen to that grandson. Phillips Way had assumed it meant death, a sacrifice, but through his research, he'd learned the truth. The keeper didn't consume souls. It collected them, imprisoned them, used them as fuel for its continued existence. More importantly, Phillips Way had discovered that the keeper wasn't a singular entity. It was a title, a role that was passed from one trapped soul to another. The current keeper had once been someone like Brenda, someone who'd walk through the red door thinking they were fulfilling a contract, only to become the next keeper, bound to collect debts for eternity. The contract was designed to perpetuate itself. Each person who walked through the door became the next keeper, and the previous keeper was finally released. It was a chain of suffering that stretched back centuries, each link forged from someone's desperation and sealed with their eternal servitude. Phillips Way had written that this constituted fraud. The contract promised one thing, a simple exchange of life for benefits, but delivered something entirely different. If he could prove this to the current keeper, if he could present evidence of the deception, the contract would be void. He'd been preparing to do exactly that when he died. Brenda's hands shook as she read the final entry, dated the day before Phillips Way's death. He'd written that he'd found proof, had discovered the identity of the original keeper, the first person who'd made this terrible deal and created the chain. He'd hidden the proof somewhere safe, somewhere his family would eventually find it. The entry ended with a single line: "Look where the light cannot reach, where the door meets the darkness. The truth is in the threshold." Brenda looked up from the journal, her heart pounding. The threshold, the space between the door and the frame. She ran from the study, down the stairs, to the red door. She examined it carefully, running her hands along the frame, looking for anything unusual. And there, carved into the wood so faintly she almost missed it, was a small symbol. She pressed it, and a section of the frame popped open, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside was a single piece of parchment, older than the contract, written in a language Brenda didn't recognize. But at the bottom, translated into English, was a name and a date: Marcus Ashford, 1623. The first keeper, the eternal prisoner. Brenda had found it, the proof, the evidence that would void the contract. But as she stood there, holding the parchment, she heard something that made her blood run cold. Footsteps, coming from upstairs, slow and deliberate, coming closer. The seventh day had begun. The footsteps were wrong. That was Brenda's first thought as she stood frozen in the doorway, clutching the ancient parchment against her chest. They were too heavy, too measured, each step landing with a weight that made the floorboards groan and the walls shudder. This wasn't the sound of a person walking. This was the sound of something else. something that wore the shape of humanity like an ill-fitting costume. Brenda's instincts screamed at her to run, to burst through the front door and never look back. But she forced herself to stay still, to think. Running wouldn't help. She'd learned enough over the past 6 days to know that the Keeper didn't operate by normal rules of space and time. If it wanted her, it would find her anywhere. The only thing that mattered now was the parchment in her hands, and whether she could use it before her time ran out. The footsteps reached the top of the stairs and paused. Brenda could feel eyes on her, even though she couldn't see anyone. The air in the house had changed, becoming thick and oppressive, like the atmosphere before a storm. The temperature dropped so quickly that her breath came out in visible puffs of white vapor. Then it spoke. The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, resonating through the walls themselves. It was neither male nor female, neither young nor old. It was the sound of autumn leaves scraping across concrete, of ice cracking on a frozen lake, of the last breath leaving a dying body. It said her name, not a question, a statement, an acknowledgement. Brenda Philips, the inheritor, the debt made flesh. Brenda's throat was so tight she could barely speak, but she forced the words out anyway. She said that she knew what the Keeper was, what it wanted, and that she'd found evidence that the contract was fraudulent. She held up the parchment with shaking hands, her phone's light illuminating the ancient writing. The presence on the stairs seemed to shift, to coalesce. Brenda watched in horror as shadow peeled away from shadow, forming a shape that was almost human. It descended the stairs slowly, each step deliberate, and as it moved into the dim light filtering through the boarded windows, Brenda finally saw the Keeper. It wore the form of a man, tall and thin, dressed in clothes that seemed to come from no particular era. Its face was smooth and ageless, beautiful in the way that marble statues are beautiful, perfect and cold, and utterly devoid of life. But its eyes were wrong. They were too dark, too deep, like looking into wells that had no bottom. And when it smiled, Brenda saw that its teeth were too white, too sharp, too many. The Keeper stopped at the bottom of the stairs, maintaining a distance of perhaps 10 feet from Brenda. It tilted its head, studying her with those terrible eyes. And when it spoke again, its voice came from the mouth that smiled and never stopped smiling. It told her that she was clever, just like her grandfather. Philip's way had been clever too, had almost found a way out. But clever wasn't the same as wise. Clever people thought they could outsmart forces older than human civilization. Wise people knew when to accept their fate. Brenda's hands tightened on the parchment. She said that the document proved the Keeper had committed fraud, that the contract promised a simple exchange but delivered eternal servitude. The original contract with Marcus Ashford in 1623 had established a chain of suffering, with each new victim becoming the next Keeper. That wasn't what Philip's Way had agreed to. The contract was void. The Keeper's smile widened impossibly, stretching its face in ways that faces shouldn't stretch. It moved closer, and Brenda instinctively stepped back, pressing herself against the doorframe. The entity stopped just outside the line of salt. She'd laid across the threshold, and for the first time, Brenda saw something like annoyance flicker across its perfect features. It said that she'd been talking to Solomon Gray, that foolish man who thought he understood the rules. It asked her if Solomon had told her what happened to people who tried to break their contracts, if he'd mentioned the ones who'd fought back and lost, the ones who'd suffered fates far worse than simply walking through the door. Brenda's voice came out stronger than she felt. She said that she didn't care about threats, that she had proof of deception, and according to every supernatural law she'd researched, that meant the contract was invalid. She demanded to be released from the debt. The Keeper laughed. The sound was like breaking glass, like screaming birds, like the world ending. It said that Brenda misunderstood the nature of the game. Yes, the parchment was real. Yes, it proved that the original contract had contained deception. But there was one thing Philip's Way hadn't discovered. One thing Solomon Gray didn't know. The contract could only be voided if the evidence was presented to the Keeper before the 7th day, and it was already past midnight. The 7th day had arrived hours ago, while Brenda had been sleeping fitfully in her apartment, gathering her courage for this confrontation. Her time was up. Brenda felt the world tilt beneath her feet. She pulled out her phone with trembling hands, checking the time. 12:47 a.m. The Keeper was right. She was too late. But even as despair threatened to overwhelm her, something else rose up inside Brenda. The same stubborn determination that had driven her to search for answers instead of running. The same refusal to accept defeat that had been in her grandfather's blood and now ran through her veins. She said that the contract specified the debt had to be paid willingly. She wasn't willing. She would never be willing. And if the keeper tried to take her by force, that would constitute a breach of the contract's terms. The keeper's smile finally faltered. For the first time, it looked at Brenda with something other than amused condescension. It studied her face, her posture, the set of her jaw, and Brenda saw recognition dawn in those bottomless eyes. It said that she really was Philips Way's granddaughter. The same fire, the same foolish courage. It asked her if she knew how Philips Way had really died. Brenda said nothing, but her silence was answer enough. The keeper told her that Philips Way had made the same choice she was making now. He'd refused to deliver his grandson, had found the evidence of fraud, and had tried to break the contract. But he'd been too late, just as Brenda was too late. And when he'd refused to comply, when he'd stood in this very house and declared that he would never willingly send his family to suffer, the keeper had shown him what happened to people who broke their deals. It had shown him the future, every possible timeline, every outcome, and in every single one, Philips Way's refusal led to suffering for everyone he loved. His son would die young in a car accident. His grandchildren would face tragedy after tragedy. His entire family line would be cursed, plagued by misfortune and death, until someone finally gave in and honored the contract. Philips Way had seen all of this in an instant, had watched his family's future collapse into darkness, and the horror of it, the weight of knowing that his defiance would destroy everyone he loved, had stopped his heart. The keeper moved closer, its face now inches from the salt line. It said that it was offering Brenda the same choice. She could refuse, could fight, could cling to her stubborn pride, and the keeper would let her go. It would release her from the immediate debt, but everyone she'd ever loved would suffer. Her mother would develop a painful, terminal illness. Her friends would face accidents and tragedies. Anyone who'd ever meant anything to Brenda would be touched by darkness, and she would know it was because of her choice. Or she could walk through the red door willingly. She could honor the contract, take her place as the next keeper, and her family would be spared. They would live long, happy lives, never knowing what she'd sacrificed for them. Brenda felt tears streaming down her face. The choice was impossible. Either she condemned herself to eternal servitude, or she condemned everyone she loved to suffering and death. There was no third option, no clever loophole, no last-minute escape. The keeper extended its hand across the salt line, palm up, waiting. It said that she had until sunrise to decide. 3 more hours. It would wait. Brenda sank to the floor, her back against the wall, the parchment still clutched in her hands. The keeper remained standing, patient and still as a statue, its hand still extended in that terrible invitation. The house around them was silent, except for the sound of Brenda's ragged breathing and the distant patter of rain that had started falling again outside. She thought about her mother, who'd already lost a husband and would be devastated to lose a daughter. She thought about her friends, about Danny with his terrible jokes and his good heart, about everyone who'd ever shown her kindness. Could she really condemn them all to suffer because she was too afraid to walk through a door? But she also thought about Marcus Ashford, whoever he'd been in 1623, someone desperate enough to make a deal with something dark and powerful, someone who'd walked through that door thinking it was a simple exchange, only to discover he'd become a prisoner, a collector of souls, a perpetuator of the same cycle that had trapped him. How many people had suffered because of that original deal? How many lives had been destroyed across 400 years? If she walked through the door, she would become the next keeper. And someday, decades or centuries from now, she would stand in front of someone else, offering them the same impossible choice. The cycle would continue forever, an endless chain of suffering and sacrifice. Brenda looked up at the keeper, studying its perfect, empty face. She asked it a question she'd been wondering since Solomon had told her the truth. She asked if it had been human once, if it remembered what that was like. The keeper's expression didn't change, but something flickered in its dark eyes. After a long moment, it spoke. Its voice was different now, quieter, almost sad. It said that it had been human a very long time ago. It had been a mother who'd made a deal to save her dying child. The child had lived, had grown up, healthy and strong, and when the debt came due, the mother had walked through the door thinking she was giving her life. Instead, she'd been given a different kind of life, an eternal one, collecting debts, watching centuries pass, forgetting slowly what it felt like to be warm, to be loved, to be real. Brenda asked how many people had been keepers before the entity standing in front of her, how many links were in the chain. The keeper said it didn't remember. Dozens, certainly. Perhaps hundreds. Time moved strangely when you existed between worlds. Years blurred together. Faces became indistinguishable. After a while, the only thing that mattered was the contract, the debt, the endless cycle. Brenda wiped her tears away with the back of her hand. She asked if the keeper wanted to be free, if it wanted the cycle to end. The question seemed to surprise the entity. It lowered its hand slowly, and for the first time, its smile disappeared completely. It said that wanting was a human concept. It had stopped wanting anything a long time ago. It simply existed. It simply was. But Brenda saw something in those dark eyes. A flicker of something that might have been hope, or might have been the memory of hope. And, in that moment, she understood what she had to do. She stood up, her legs shaky but her resolve firm. She told the keeper that she had a different proposal. The contract was based on deception, on the lie that walking through the door was a simple sacrifice when it was actually enslavement. But what if she could break the cycle entirely? What if, instead of becoming the next keeper, she walked through the door and refused to take the role? What if she let the position remain unfilled? The keeper stared at her, its face unreadable. It said that such a thing had never been attempted. The contract required a replacement. If she walked through but refused to serve, the contract would be in limbo, unfulfilled, broken. Brenda asked, what would happen then? Would the keeper be freed? Would the cycle end? The entity was silent for a long moment. Then it said that it didn't know. The rules were old, written by forces that predated human civilization. But theoretically, if the contract was broken from the inside, if someone walked through the door but refused to accept the role, the entire structure might collapse. The current keeper might be released, or they might both be trapped forever in the space between worlds, neither alive nor dead, neither free nor bound. It was a gamble, a terrible, uncertain gamble with stakes that couldn't be higher. Brenda looked at the red door behind the keeper, at the key still in the lock, at the threshold that separated her world from whatever lay beyond. She thought about her grandfather, who'd tried to break the contract from the outside and failed. Maybe the only way to truly break it was from the inside. She told the keeper her decision. She would walk through the door. She would honor the letter of the contract. But she would not become the next keeper. She would refuse the role, would break the cycle, would gamble everything on the chance that her defiance might free them both. The keeper asked if she understood the risk. If she failed, if the contract simply trapped her without breaking, she would suffer for eternity. There would be no escape, no second chance, no mercy. Brenda said she understood. But she also understood that some cycles needed to be broken, even if breaking them was dangerous, even if it meant sacrificing herself, because the alternative was allowing the suffering to continue forever, and she couldn't live with that choice. The keeper stepped aside. In 400 years, no one had ever made this choice. Brenda was either the bravest person it had encountered, or the most foolish. Brenda walked forward on trembling legs, crossing the salt line toward the red door. Behind her, the keeper spoke one last time. If she succeeded, it wanted her to know its name had been Elizabeth, that it had been human once, that it still remembered hope. Brenda turned the key. The door opened to blinding, terrible, beautiful light. She thought of her mother, her grandfather, Elizabeth. Then she stepped through. The door slammed shut. In her apartment, the wooden boxes crumbled to dust. 3 months later, Solomon Gray updated his records, marking Brenda Phillips's file as unknown outcome. The packages had stopped. The house burned down 3 days after Brenda disappeared, no explanation. Brenda's mother filed a missing persons report. Life moved on. But Solomon noticed something strange. No new cases. No mysterious packages. For 3 months, the centuries-old phenomenon had simply stopped. Solomon chose to believe that somewhere beyond doors and between worlds, Brenda Phillips had done something impossible. She'd broken a 400-year chain. She'd freed Elizabeth. Maybe she'd found a way home. Solomon closed the file. Then he smiled.